Pamela Hughes, a member of the Princeton Adult School Board, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Harold Foster. Townsend Martin, class of 1917, professor of art and professor of art and archaeology at Princeton University and director of the Gauss Seminars in Criticism. Professor Foster, who earned his PhD from CUNY, teaches lecture and seminar courses in modernist and contemporary art and criticism at Princeton, as well as teaching in the programs of media and modernity and European cultural studies. As a recent recipient of Guggenheim and CASPA fellowships, he's working on a textbook on 20th century art, as well as on a project on the problem of the arbitrary in modernist art. His most recent book is Design and Crime and Other Diatribes, published in 2002. Another book, Prosthetic Gods, concerning the relation between modernism and psychoanalysis, is due out in fall 2004, and a book on pop will follow in early 2005. Professor Foster writes regularly for the London Review of Books, the Los Angeles Times Book Review, October, and the New Left Review. This is our last series, our last lecture in this series on utopias. And let me just say before I bring Professor Foster to the podium that you have, for those of you who've been attending, you have course evaluation sheets. It'd be wonderful if you could fill those out and leave them here this evening. For the spring semester, we will be looking at, the title of the series is With Regard to Good and Evil, Old Problems in a New Century, and this will be dealing with ethical issues in the modern world. I'm delighted now to invite to the podium Professor Harold Foster for the Anne B. Shepard Lecture Series on Utopias, the Utopian Dimension in 20th Century Art and Architecture.
Maybe you should do the course evaluations before I start. Because, just to reduce expectations from the get-go, I'm not a historian of utopia, not a theorist of utopia. It's not a subject I teach, so I don't really have a ready lecture to offer you tonight. But I will do what I can. If you can't hear me, let me know, because we'll be lost. It'll be pointless if that happens. What I want to do is not talk about utopia per se, in other words, actual projects for a perfect community, although there are certainly some in the 20th century to deal with. What I want to do is focus on a somewhat more vague concern, which is the utopian impulse in 20th century art and architecture. And I want to trace the ups and downs of this utopian impulse, the ebbs and flows. So I will stretch the term. So bear with me. I do have, as a good art historian, all kinds of slides, and I will rely on them to get through. I will also try to stop 45 minutes or 50 minutes, because I'd love to talk to you about some of the images, some of the projects that I will show to you, and field any question that you might have as best as I can. Very simply, just a few terms of reference, definition to begin with. The utopian impulse is very much on the march in modernist art and architecture. And by modernist, well, I will tell you what I mean in a second. But just for the time being, think of the pre-war period before World War II. It's very much in advance during this time, for the most part. And I think it's very much under attack in the post-war period, especially in contemporary times, for obvious reasons. World War II, the Holocaust, certain failures closer to the present that we can discuss too. But I will, for the most part, I will concentrate on the pre-war period. I want to rush through a few examples in the post-war period and talk a little bit about the present and end with a project or two very much in the present and very much in the news. But we need a definition of modernist art and architecture to begin with, modernist avant-garde, if you like. And for me, for the most part, this will be centered again in the first half of the 20th century, before World War II. Now, basically, I think of this modernist avant-garde, and I mean movements from Cubism and Surrealism to the Bauhaus and Constructivism and on and on. I think that they're triangulated, that they're in a field essentially of three principal forces that become extremely important by the turn of the century. The first force that determines the modernist avant-garde is, of course, traditional culture, bourgeois culture. And it's centered for the modernist avant-gardes in the old art academies, the old training of the artists according to traditional genres, traditional forms of art. So the modernist avant-garde is articulated in opposition, first, to bourgeois culture, the traditional art academy. Second, it's inspired very much by technological development at the time. We like to talk about a second industrial revolution that occurs towards the turn of the century, certainly in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. It has enormous force. Second industrial revolution, perhaps the first machine age is a term that's familiar to you. But it's certainly a revolution in the technologies of everyday life, especially an extraordinary advance in technologies of transportation, obviously the automobile, the airplane, but also techniques of reproduction of representations, of images. So these two things in particular, of course there are other kinds of technological advances at this time, but the transformation in transportation, physical transportation, and image reproduction is very important to the modernist avant-garde. The third force that I think we have to reckon with when we talk about the modernist avant-garde, and especially its utopian drive, its utopian impulse, I think it's important to remember the extraordinary inspiration in all kinds of ways of the socialist revolutions that erupted in the midst of World War I, especially, of course, in Russia, but also in Germany. There were serious socialist revolts there, Hungary too, throughout Eastern Europe in particular. So these three forces triangulate the modernist avant-garde, the opposition to old forms of art, the inspiration of technological development, and the sense that the world was transformed politically too. One more preliminary remark before I get to the slides. I think it's also important to remember that the utopian impulse in art of the last century, in architecture too, and we can say the 19th century as well, that it expresses very different desires at very different times. Again, very simply, one can think about these expressions in this way. Utopia can express the ambition of a new group, a new class, if you like, that is on the rise, expression of its vision, of its future, and the future that it holds for all of society, for the world at large. Hence, there was a flurry of utopian thought, utopian projects in art and architecture, elsewhere in the culture, after the French Revolution, after the great bourgeois revolution, when the middle class seemed to be the new historical agent on the scene. The same thing after the proletarian revolution, again, Russian Revolution in 1917. There was a flurry of utopian activity as a new group, a new class seemed to be on the rise with a new vision of the community, the society to come. At the same time, and this is extremely important for me, it's utopian impulse, utopian projects can also be an expression of a critique of the present. It doesn't always suggest a completely other realm, completely other society in the future. Utopias can also be about a critique of what is, of the present. And I think one sees both kinds of utopia in 20th century art and architecture. Okay, let's have the lights down. Lights down in the auditorium. Do I do that or do you? Hey Marilyn, can you turn the lights down in the auditorium from up there, or do I do it here?
You do it.
Well, she might have a faster way to get to it. Oh, now I'm in dark up here. It's an art history lecture without a technical screw up. Okay. And can you focus the one on the left, please? So I will go through these slides in a fairly fast and furious way, but it won't be entirely coherent. Can you focus the one on the left, Marilyn? How's that? Okay. There's always a screw up in an art history lecture, believe me. Okay, please follow with me with the slide list. And share them if you don't have them. The image on the left is of the Crystal Palace by the English engineer Joseph Paxton. Marilyn, you have the timer on the left. Turn the timer off on the left projector, please. Okay. It's from 1851. It's from a Universal Exhibition, World's Fair, in London in 1851. And this is, for me, just a signal moment of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, in its full ascendancy. And it's one example of its own utopian vision. It has developed new techniques, new materials of construction, of iron and glass. And no one had ever seen such a building before. It was built to hold this exhibition of industrial goods, as well as cultural works too. But it was really one example when the English bourgeoisie, which was really in charge at this point, showed to the world its vision of the present, its vision of the future. A future of worldly goods, potentially for all. The image on the right, of course, the Eiffel Tower, Gustave Eiffel, another engineer. Again, it's important that some of the utopian figures that I want to cite at the beginning our engineers, are the real constructors of this new industrial world of modernity. Built, of course, for the 1889 exhibition, World Exhibition, now in Paris. Again, almost engineering for engineering's sake, an expression of the sheer power of new technologies, new techniques of construction. But this is the bright side of bourgeois modernity. It shows a particular version of this world. Of course, this world is also one of factories, with very harsh labor conditions, of new densities of the city, with difficult living situations. So there's another side to this utopian image of the modern. And it led artists, as we enter into the 20th century, to imagine escapes, not always utopian escapes, sometimes pastoral escapes, sometimes just an escape into nature or to a fantasy of the natural world. This is a terrific painting down in Philadelphia by Henri Matisse, 1905, The Joy of Life. And here, Matisse, one of our favorites, I hope, if you like modern art at all, invokes a world far away from industrial modernity, far away from city life, a world of pastoral bliss, really. This is not strictly utopian, but it's utopian in its impulse to imagine a place of peace, of pleasure. There's no difference here, really. I mean, there even gender differences seem to be obscured in certain figures. It's hard to tell what this couple is here. It's clearly nude. There's this celebratory communal dance, which is a favorite motif of Matisse. This extraordinary swirl of color and line evokes a world not marked by division at all. So in a sense, even though it's technically a pastoral vision, there is a utopian impulse here. But this vision is hard to retain in a world as intensive as the industrial world of urban modernity. It comes under enormous pressure as we proceed just a little bit into the 20th century. I think it's felt even here with this very early abstract painting by the great expressionist, born in Russia, really German expressionist, Vasily Kandinsky. The title of this work is On the Theme of the Last Judgment. So even though there's still this sense of communion with the natural, maybe even the cosmic here, there's a sense that it's under enormous pressure, this communion. It's very difficult to attain and to retain. And so there's an apocalyptic dimension here as well. Clearly, 1913, we're just at the moment where Europe is at the precipice of World War I, and World War I changes everything. I don't think, as a modernist, that one can underestimate the impact, the importance of World War I on European culture. In many ways, it's said often before, that this is really where the 19th century dies. Values, in many ways, utopian values, again, of the bourgeoisie, and the old regime altogether, come to ruin. But there are very different kinds of responses to World War I in different places. And I want to talk about Russia first. The painting on the left is one of the most famous works in modernist studies. It's by the Russian suprematist abstract painter Kazimir Malevich. Maybe some of you saw the Malevich show at the Guggenheim Museum in the spring. It's black square. It's one of the first abstractions. complete abstractions from 1915, right in the midst of the war. And this is one of the ambiguities about abstract painting in this moment, in its beginnings. Does it declare the end of representation, the end of a particular kind of art? Or is it a utopian beginning of its own? I think this ambiguity is almost irreducible in these early abstractions. The reason why it's so cracked is that it's in poor condition, and but it's the first real announcement that there's a new order, a new cultural order, a new artistic order in response to the developments that I sketched at the beginning. The image on the right is actually three paintings, three monochromes, titled Pure Red, Pure Yellow, Pure Blue, by an associate, a Russian associate of Malevich named Alexander Rodchenko. We will see him again in a second. This is from 1921. Both these artists actually passed through cubist painting to get to abstract work. But Rodchenko is even more insistent than Malevich. In Malevich, again, there's this ambiguity. Is this the end of painting or a new beginning? Rodchenko is quite specific. He says a few years after he paints these monochromes, these three canvases, where there's just nothing but pure color, in 1921, he states that he did these works as a demonstration of the end of a particular kind of pictorial tradition, particular kind of representation in art. He wanted to present a clean slate, tabula rasa. This is very often the first move in the utopian impulse in the 20th century, to just clear the books. And this is one of the most famous instances, at least in painting, of this idea. We begin from scratch. We begin from, indeed, the primary colors. Malevich, if you read his texts, it's really an extraordinary thinker, often very confused, but he will say things in his writings like, I burst through the lampshade of the sky into the infinity beyond. I mean, abstraction for him really wasn't just about the cancellation of representation of old ways of painting. It was also the move towards a completely different order of space, of time, that he hoped to somehow connect with the revolution elsewhere in his society. But here, this is a painting on the left, Suprematist composition. He called his abstraction suprematist. This actually predates the revolution in 1917. This is from 1914, 1915. And he calls it airplane. So even in the abstract elements, there's still some sense of an object in the world, perhaps. We can make out some hint of a plane, but clearly it's a plane in flight, a plane in motion. Again, this thrill to new possibilities of the modern period. Now, Malevich was not simply an abstract painter. He also developed his abstraction in architectural models, too, that were indeed utopian. It's clearly this model could not be built. It's not an answer to any program of use and function. But he turned his abstract idiom in painting into a means, he thought, to completely rethink architecture and urbanism as well. None of these models were executed in any form whatsoever, but there is the sense that they might be. And I wanted to stress this impulse towards abstraction, this impulse towards tabula rasa, a whole new way to construct the world, because it's for some people it has enormous utopian force. For other people, especially as we move towards the present, it has enormous dystopian force. This is what so many people in our own period after World War II hated about modernist art, modernist abstraction. It's hubris, this idea that it could start afresh and tell us, in effect, how we should live, how we should be. But I think we also have to recover the feelings, the thoughts of some of these figures as they wanted to participate in this new project of a new country, a new socialist country. Another extremely important figure in this regard, the Russian, is Vladimir Tatlin. Perhaps some of you have seen this model before. Tatlin was not, he began as a painter, but really moved into sculpture and then into quasi-architectural projects like this monument. He designed it as a model for the Third International Congress of the Communist Party that was to be held in 1919-1920. Clearly, if we can just go back for a second to the Eiffel Tower. He meant it, in a sense, as the socialist riposte, the socialist answer to the capitalist Eiffel Tower. The monument was to be much taller than the Eiffel Tower. As you know, the Eiffel Tower is 300 meters high. So clearly, in an impoverished country as war-torn Russia was at this point, there were no resources for such a monument that would tower well over 1,000 feet. But again, it's this attempt to find in industrial materials, in steel and glass, a figure for a new order. Let me just show you one of the drawings for the monument. Unlike the Eiffel Tower, which was very static, Tatlin clearly had the Eiffel Tower in mind. He wanted his monument to be very dynamic. That's this spiral. Actually, there are two spirals that spin together. He wanted it dynamic to express a new country on the march, but also an idea, Marxist idea, of a history in development, a dialectical development. So the monument called for in his design, three forms that would rotate at different speeds within the spiral. The big structure would house the meeting place of the International Communist Party as it met in Moscow every year. And it would rotate at the rate of once a year. Here was to be you can tell how utopian this is, the meeting place of the Soviet Communist Party, and it would rotate as an assembly. The structure would rotate at the rate of one revolution a month. Then at the top was the structure that was to house the media wing of the new society, if you like, the propaganda wing of the party, and it was to rotate at the rate of once a day. So the whole thing is to be in motion, in keeping with the rhythms of historical development. It's one of the most extraordinary utopian projects, but as such, it remains at the level of a project only. And here, by the way, is Tatlin, Soviet worker guard. Now this, Tatlin really caught the imagination of other artists and architects elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in Russia as well. This is a photomontage, a collage, actually not a photomontage, There are collage elements from magazines by a young associate of Tatlin who was even closer to Malevich, named El Lissitzky. It's titled Tatlin at Work on the Monument. So this idea that the artist as engineer, the artist as architect, could construct or help to construct a new order, new social order, new world order, fired the imaginations of all kinds of artists. And this idea of the artist as constructor of the world is extremely important to movements like constructivism in the Soviet Union and the Bauhaus in Germany. This is a self-portrait by Tatlin, and note how he, in this montage, how he superimposes his head, his eye, right through his hand, and the tool that it carries to effectively design this new world, to rethink its very alphabet. Again, in an abstract idiom that they all thought relevant to modernity. Sometimes this abstract idiom could serve ideological purposes too. We could say that all these are ideological purposes, but even propaganda purposes. This is another famous image, abstract work by Lissitzky called Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge. And this was done just at the moment of the Civil War in Russia. The whites, clearly the communists, I mean, the whites were the old Tsarist followers, and the reds were the Bolsheviks. So even through abstraction, they felt that they could advance this cause. A dramatic example of that kind of modernist propaganda. But I mean, Lissitzky was a true believer, as many of these figures were. Another one of his images. This is actually a figure designed for the opera Victory Over the Sun, 1920-21. You can see that it's actually, I don't know what to call it really, a humanoid figure. It's a human redesigned almost as a set of girders, the body reconfigured as these abstract suprematist shapes that, again, Malevich and Lissitzky developed. This is called the new, as in the new man, the new woman. This idea that we as beings, as subjects, could be completely reworked, redefined. Just one more Lissitzky's, I think the utopian impulse, or perhaps for some of us, the dystopian impulse, is extremely strong in his work. Another famous design, of course, never got beyond the level of a design, the Tribune platform for Lenin. Here you see a figure, a famous pose of Lenin as he addresses the masses. But again, this celebration through these industrial girders of a new dynamic city, a new dynamic order, and leader suited. Here again, we know what has happened to this order, so it's hard not to look back on some of these images with real skepticism, if not real horror. This is by another constructivist artist named Gustav Klusis, associate of Lissitzky's. It's in bad condition because this is actually the original of a poster that was supposed to be reproduced many, many times over. And it shows Lenin bestride the world. The title of this particular piece is the electrification of the entire country. We have to remember how backward, even in terms of basic industry, Russia was at this time. So again, this idea that this new class, these new leaders might bring this country into the modern age propagandistic to be sure, but also utopian too, at least in part. But it's hard not to look at this communist colossus and shudder at this point. Just to stay with Russia as it is morphed into the Soviet Union for a moment, I wanted to give you an example of the kinds of utopian mass festivals that were conjured up to celebrate the revolution, different anniversaries. This is by a woman, again, an associate of all these other figures that I've mentioned, Lyubov Popova. And the title of this festival was to be the struggle and victory of the Soviets. It's again done in 1921 in celebration of the revolution. You can see these kind of, again, figures of new cities on the rise. A city that's almost entirely mechanical, supported somehow impossibly by what these are really, these thin dirigibles. So this new order will rise up in all kinds of ways. It will announce its causes dramatically across the sky. For the most part, these remain projects, or indeed just festivals, theatrical productions. This is a famous set design, also by Popova, the great Russian dramatist Meyerhold. This is a play called The Magnanimous Cuckold from 1922. Popova designed this extraordinary set. It's nothing like a naturalistic set, the same way that Malevich and Rodchenko wanted to throw over a representational painting. These figures wanted to throw over naturalistic drama. And Meyerhold, theorist of drama, most important one at this time, even developed this idea that actors should act mechanically, developed this idea of biomechanics, so that they would be represented just as, not as individuals really, but as almost cogs in this kind of new machine of the new Soviet order. A few more examples of this, of figures at work in this new order. This is our friend Rodchenko again, the guy who did the three monochromes, pure red, yellow, and blue, in clothes that he designed for industrial workers. Behind him you see some of his abstract instructions that can be opened up and condensed, that were meant to hang. These were mostly experiments that were to be then put into practice in functional ways. But again, this figure of the artist as an engineer, artist as designer, redesigner of the social order. Rodchenko was very gifted, as was Lissitzky, as a maker of photomontages, posters, and book covers. This is one of the most famous Rodchenko designs. This is for a poster to celebrate literacy. This is from 1925. We're now into the early Stalin years. But these artists still very much support the regime, and the regime is ambivalently there for them as well. That will change momentarily. You see this peasant woman who shouts out the need for all her compatriots to read. This, I think, has a real utopian dimension. This idea that not only electrification, but literacy can be brought to all the masses now. But again, from our perspective, some of these images of the new communist society look fairly grim. This is, again, Glusis. This is titled In the Storm of the Third Year of the 5-Year Plan. So we're really into the heart of the early Stalin years, in the midst of the first five-year plan with obvious tragic consequences for many people. You get this sense of workers almost as shock troopers, again, to force this industrialization through. You can see this extraordinary evocation and construction of a whole new industrial order down here. But it's already creepily militarized, this industrialization of the new Soviet society. Here too, it's hard not to read this in a spooky way. This poster by Glucius for building socialism under the banner of Lenin. Again, city in tumultuous rise here, but this is from 1931. Lenin is long dead, shadowed here ominously by Lenin. So at this point, just about a year or so later, that Stalin will really come down hard on all modernist artists and architects. He will proclaim socialist realism, the only form of culture that the regime will tolerate. And so many modernists are forced into exile, some die in camps. Some of the figures that I've just mentioned so far do die in camps. Some go into internal exile. Some actually continue to support the regime. But let me just show you what happens a little bit to the work of the two great fathers of revolutionary Russian art, Malevich and Tatlin. This is the work of Malevich from the late 1920s, after he's retired, in effect, from any involvement in the Communist project. I think these are very, these figures are very difficult to read. They're called the sportsmen. And you can still see that there's this, he retains this commitment to color, to abstract color. But the figures seem faceless. They don't seem to express the new as much as the reified, the anonymous. Similarly with Tatlin, he goes into an internal artistic exile. He survives, as does Malevich, but under very difficult conditions. And he keeps his utopian impulse alive, but in a very fantastic way. He develops this project which he calls the Tatlin, which is a flying machine, non-mechanical, to be flown by one person. That's actually Tatlin here in the photograph. So he recovers one of the oldest utopian dreams of humankind, really, to fly. He looks back to Leonardo, looks past the communist present, looks past the capitalist present to a whole other past of utopian longing, if you like. Okay, let's move on to Germany and how it responds to the provocation not only of a new modern urban industrial world, but of World War I, its devastation. This is a drawing by a young architect at the time, Bruno Taut. It's called Alpine Architecture from 1919. Germany, as you know, absolutely devastated by the war. So the first response is an expressionist response. It's an attempt to somehow reclaim a body that's just completely torn up by the war. Reclaim a community completely torn up by the war. And to do so almost in mystical terms. So architects like Bruno Taut imagine, again, alpine architecture, the glass architecture, the crystal glass architecture that will almost mystically call together the German folk again. Again, this doesn't necessarily look towards the Nazi corruption of this impulse. I think this really is a utopian impulse. But here too, as in the Soviet instance, there's a way in which these immediate post-World War I intimations of utopian longing turn very grim, very dark 10, 15 years down the road. I think, again, I hope I have time to come back to this point, but there's an evocation of this kind of glass architecture in the designs of the World Trade Center, the World Trade Center site too, and positively and problematically so. But immediately again, after World War I in Germany, there's an attempt to heal the body, reunite the community. This is a woodcut, an old technique associated with the German past, called cathedral. Again, it's kind of longing for a medieval moment where the community really was integral. This woodcut served as the cover for the announcement of the Bauhaus, the most important school of modernist art, craft, architecture, and design, which rose up in the ruins of World War I. It begins in 1919. So the announcement of the Bauhaus comes with this cathedral, this kind of medieval turn image on its cover, and this kind of symbol of these stars is that under building, under architecture, the other arts and crafts will be gathered, and we will move away from industrial division. We saw what the war has done to us through industrial death. We will reclaim craft practices as a way to reclaim social community. And you see this sort of worked out still in the pedagogical program of the early Bauhaus, which I showed you here. Everything is articulated around building. But it's really an attempt to work with basic materials, basic forms. But midway through the life of the Bauhaus begins and ends with the Weimar Republic. It begins in 1919 and ends in 1933 as an institution. Midway, the Bauhaus, led by the great architect Walter Gropius, its first director, they play down craft and move, handmade craft, and move towards industrial design. Here I show you just, I could have showed you many images. This is a photograph of the office of the director of the Bauhaus, of Walter Gropius, in its Dessau instance. The Bauhaus began in Weimar, moved to Dessau, and ended up in Berlin. And here you see, again, this idea of total work of art under architecture, but here very much in keeping not with craft, but with industrial design. These fabulous light fixtures by Marion Brandt, one of the great designers of the Bauhaus. Great abstract textile work by Gerda Stutzer, another important woman in the teacher in the Bauhaus, and the abstract furniture. So this is one now two versions of the utopian impulse in the Bauhaus. First, an attempt to reclaim mystical and medieval ideas of craft and community. Another, to advance through industry to another kind of world that wouldn't have the problems of industrial life that's confronted so far. But this all ends abruptly, as I suggested, in 1933. This is a newspaper story, newspaper image of the closure of the Bauhaus by the Nazis. It's actually one of the very few first things that the Nazis did culturally, so you can see how much power that they thought the Bauhaus idea had. They were enemies, in fact. And this is a moment, as you know, when modernist art and architecture then becomes pillar the Nazis stage a show of modernist art, which is Entente Kunst, which means degenerate art. This is traveled throughout Nazi lands. This is a crowd as it waits outside to go in to this parody of modernist art. The Nazis collected, took modernist art from the German museums and elsewhere and set it up in this show for public ridicule. Ironically, it was perhaps the most highly attended show of modern art ever. Here you can see, this is a photograph of a gallery. There are these hideous labels that mock this motley presentation of work. Ironically, the modernist work that the Nazis held in greatest contempt was actually German. It's German expressions. You would think that they would revile abstraction the most, and they did associate abstraction with Bolshevism. But they were most provoked by the expressionist deformation of the body, this extraordinary crucifix, Beckmann. That disturbed them most. So here's where the utopian impulses, or at least the desire for another world that runs throughout all modernist art, is countered by a political regime that has its own ideas about the future. Just to give you an idea of the Nazi aesthetic, well, here you see Hitler, Mussolini, Goebbels, and Himmler at a show set up to oppose the degenerate art show, a show of proper German art in a museum built for proper German art in Munich. Here's the cover of the pamphlet for the degenerate art show, and the cover of the pamphlet for the great German art show, roughly at the same time. You can see the difference in aesthetic. They held, this is a primitivist work, work by the modernist German Otto Freudenich, obviously very involved with tribal art. For the Nazis, this again was a deformation of the human body that they could not abide. They wanted, of course, to reclaim this Aryan classical culture through the this ideal saccharine human body. Again, just to continue with the Nazi and fascist counter to the utopian idea of the future that moves throughout modernist art. This is a facade for an exhibition to celebrate Mussolini. You see it in your slide list. It's an exhibition titled "Mussolini is Always Right." This is what this means here. That's what you have any doubt. This is in Rome in 1924, a little bit before he comes to power, before Hitler does. But I think it's important. It's important to see that these other regimes, Stalinist, Nazi, Italian fascist, that they present utopias of this sort too. Not utopias for all, of course not. They're actually articulated by radical exclusions. They do have very powerful visions of the future, and that's why in part they were so successful. People at large. I'm going to show you here on the right. It's the master plan for Berlin that Albert Speer designed with Hitler. He was the primary Nazi architect before he became Minister of Armaments and was consumed by the war. This was to be the new Berlin after the war. They worked on it for several years, 1936 and 1942. To get a sense of the scale of the things, these figures are absolutely monumental, beyond monumental. This is actually characteristic that other totalitarian regimes share this hyper-monumentalism. I show you this famous watercolor by Paul Klee. There's an even more famous saying by the great German critic Walter Benjamin, who essentially died in 1940, victim of the Nazis in a sense. This is the Angelus Novus, the new angel. And I want you to think back to the other figures in the Soviet material and the German material of an absolutely new future, the angel of the future. For Benjamin, this new angel really represented a figure that was blown forward into the future by all the destruction incurred in the present. So the angel of the new had become really a figure of destruction or construction. The work on the right is by a French artist, Jean Baudrier, who laid low in Paris in the Nazi occupation. It's called Head of a Hostage, and it's an evocation of horrors of the war. He actually heard hostages tortured by the Nazis from his studio. This is his representation of that horrific event. But the utopian impulse does not simply turn into a dystopian one, into a totalitarian one. I think that that's too easy a critique that we make too often. There are extraordinary utopian impulses that remain even in the pre-war period. On the left, I show you a painting, just one painting of many by Piet Mondrian. Now, Mondrian, you cannot imagine an artist more removed from society. This is abstraction at its purest. Primary colors, straightest of lines. But he also felt that even as his painting was entirely removed from the political, that it offered a model of what a utopian world could be. In this sense, that it was perfectly balanced, perfectly harmonious, but not through any forced measure of symmetry or simple rectilinearity that this would be oppressive. He argued that in his paintings he gave each individual element full expression, and at the same time kept the whole, composition of the whole. Here the analogy goes from the pictorial to the social, to the political, kept the whole together as well. It might be that the utopian impulse is only effective at this kind of remove, this level of literal abstraction. On the right is a very early work by Barnett Newman. Again, after World War II, as after World War I, there was this attempt at new beginnings, and there was indeed a utopian impulse felt there as well. This is actually called The Beginning, 1946. But there, you have to admit that, especially with the great modern architects like Le Corbusier, the great utopias that they present. This is his most famous version, Bill Radius, The Radiant City, which he proposed in the early 1930s as a way to renovate historic parts of Paris. You can see how abstract this parts of Paris position, how severe this imposition might be. Towers set down, completely empty space. This is why it's for projects like these that modern architects do so often revile. I kind of want to just rush through the remaining slides to get to the present. I won't comment on them too much. These are two projects by an artist, architect of the 1950s and 60s. The project, the artist's name, Constance, he's a Dutchman who's still alive actually. A project called New Babylon, where he wanted to imagine a new urban structure that would be given over to free play. But the irony here, the reason why I wanted to show you these slides, is that in his articulation of this new world. The constructions, the diagrams, the models often take on a grim feel, as if they cannot be, any architectural design, any urbanist design couldn't help but also be a place of discipline and punishment too, a prison of sorts. But as a new economy came into the fore in the late 50s, early 60s, new consumer economy, if you like, this too prompted, if you consider it as a way in which this is a third industrial revolution, whole new technologies come into play here, new forms of energy, new forms of media, very much like the inequality, to very much like the second industrial revolution that prompted so many modernists. Well, here too, this consumer society interested all kinds of figures, artists, and architects who we might call pop at this point, and they have utopian dimension as well. This is the image on the left is from a cover of a journal put out by an architectural group in England in the 60s, early 70s called Archigram. They developed this idea of plastic, clip-on, plug-in architecture. Architecture on the move is very much, it evokes the world of the Yellow Submarine, if you like. Pop utopia of a new city. On the right is another Archigram project that revisions how we might live in this new pop world with new media, the living pop. Again, never realized. For figures in Britain who were still lived in conditions of austerity from World War II, this American consumer society was very attractive. It had its own utopian elements that they played on, sometimes ironically, sometimes not. This is by Eduardo Palazzi, artist in England, a collage from the 1940s. He seems to delight, sometimes with moments and hints of satire, in this new world of the commodity, the sexy commodity, and commodified sexuality. Same thing with this famous little collage, it's actually a tiny work by Richard Hamilton from 1956. The new couple here, the man, the bodybuilder, the sexy partner and wife, all kinds of new technologies here, new media, modern furniture, all kinds of a complete makeover of a pop world. Now, this pop world clearly had a utopian dimension. This idea of new affluence, new prosperity, new generation in control. This is President-elect, a painting by James Rosenquist. And I show it to you because it's on view right now at the Guggenheim Museum. I encourage you to go see the James Rosenquist show there. This is a painting based on a collage of two magazine advertisements. This is for a 1949 Chevy, an old Chevrolet. And for cake, remember, the true test of a housewife, I remember this as a kid, was moist cake for some reason. Remember the Betty Crocker test of the modern home? And of course, JFK. So it seems to kind of parade the good life circa 1960 to 61. Yet, there's also a dark side to this pop utopia. Actually, Rosenquist repainted this work in 1964, so it actually straddles the assassination 40 years ago on Saturday. And if you have this in mind, this utopia begins to turn, to go bad. The Chevy becomes the limousine in Dallas. broken bits of cake, perhaps the body parts exploded in the car. The grotesquerie of the collage is in Bodewell, Kennedy. The real genius at this sort of expose of the dark side of the pop utopia, the new utopia of consumer culture, was of course Andy Warhol. This is one of his great silkscreens of Jackie in 1964, where he shows her in fact before and after the assassination. Another silkscreen by Warhol called Tuna Fish Disaster, also from 1963, where again he shows you the nasty underbelly of the new society of affluence. These are all victims of tuna fish botulism. Newspaper, everyday moms, everyday housewives, anonymously killed. So the power, the pleasure, the prestige of this new consumer world has its death too. Warhol was very keen to show it. Again, for every vision of a great society that LBJ would announce as a project a year or two later, there's also the reality of race riots. And this is another one of his silk screens. He takes a very famous image in Birmingham, reproduces it many times over. Even with glamour, there's death. And this extraordinary, his extraordinary appreciation of Marilyn, imaged her again and again through these silkscreen repetitions. You get the sense that she's already going to fade away. This was in fact done after her suicide. Warhol also suggests that at this point, in the early 1970s, East and West, the world at large, lives under these kind of pop icons, whether they're Marilyn or Mao. It's almost as if Warhol suggests it doesn't much matter. I just wanted to show you a few images by Gerhard Richter, who also looks skeptically at the post-war utopia. This is a painting of his, important German artist. A painting of his from the mid-1960s called Uncle Rudy. His uncle was, you can see it, a Nazi. And then I just want to suggest a feminist critique of all utopian projects with modernity. These are two works by the feminist artist Barbara Kruger. You can make a good polemic with. Sorry. Just very briefly, I wanted to talk about a few projects in the present. There's so much attention given architecture and urbanism now. And for many people, it too has a utopian dimension. I don't share that feeling at all. I think, this is the world of Frank Gehry. What I show you is a computer rendering, a night shot of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, this most celebrated building. But really, this is not an architecture of utopia, an architecture of spectacle. And I think another problematic, at least for me, development in architecture and urbanism is the fixation on trauma. And this is the Jewish Museum by Daniel Libeskind in Berlin. Set up his proposal, which, as you know, won for the World Trade Center site. This is a computer rendering. Just wanted to show you the other finalists, the project that actually I preferred. Called Think Group was led by Raphael Vignoli, the guy who designed the football stadium here, the new genomics building. We're back to Libeskind on the right. I just wanted to look back just for a second at one version of the modernist utopians. This is actually a Soviet model, a Soviet plan for a palace of proletariat culture by a guy named Ivan Leonidov. But this trope, this image of a dirigible that's about to dock at a skyscraper or some construction was everywhere in the 1920s and 30s. In communist countries and capitalist countries, there were famous images of a dirigible about to dock the spire of the Empire State Building. That's really one reason why that spire was built there in the first place. It's a utopian image of complete circulation, complete mobility through the modern city, up and down and all over the place. And obviously, that image, that utopian image of the metropolis, was devastated by the 9/11 attacks. The way this image of complete mobility was turned into its dystopian opposite. But I didn't want to end on a complete bummer. So I just bring up the monument, the Tatlin Monument again. In a way, apart from its politics, this is a vision of a utopian project. And a project by a student, a young student here at Princeton just a year or two ago. This was actually his Master's of Architecture thesis project, a young Japanese student. This is called the Wave Garden. And he designed it purely practically. He argued that it could function, but it is, as a massive field of piezoelectric panels. These are actually panels that can generate electricity. And he imagined this field of panels to sit off the coast of California and to be driven by the motions of the Pacific Sea to generate electricity for all of California, all of the West, in this sort of extraordinary utopian project for the age of Enron and Schwarzenegger. Anyway, I'll leave it there. If you have any comments or questions, feel free. No, this isn't one of them. This is a project by a student here. It has nothing to do with the World Trade Center. Yeah, no, they certainly played with there were tropes of water, clouds. They shared many things. I wonder what you all thought of those proposals.
I thought they were very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the water one was very interesting. I thought the cloud one was very interesting. I'm not so sure the one with the faces was as interesting. I think I like the abstract better.
Mm-hmm. I thought the architecture critic for the Times, Herbert Bouchon, is a person I don't agree with too often, had it right, though, that they were almost too beautiful, almost too spectacular, and that they really needed to get simple. I think, memorials, monuments work best. They're very modest, almost, like the Vietnam Memorial is a very good example. But my concern as a person very committed to New York, committed to the city, I'm not sure that New York is a city that needs to become like Washington. It needs to become a place of memorials and monuments. And I think New York celebrates its past, celebrates its dead, almost paradoxically, through its commitment to change. When you go there, part of the contract is that other people have gone there before, like you, to embrace the new. And this is a very minority opinion. Sure.
Would you like to enlarge a little bit on your comment about the architecture of spectacle versus the architecture of utopia?
I think, both Gehry and Libeskind speak to real desires, real longings that might have utopian elements. But I'm just not sure I agree with where those elements are taken. With Gehry, the architecture seems to be, very individualistic, almost idiosyncratic, very expressive to him somehow. And it's almost as if the architect has assumed the role of the artist. I find that very problematic. I also find it very problematic how maybe his science library here will be an exception. He seems to have pulled way back in his language. But I think for the most part, his architecture is used as an image that then becomes almost a logo for the client, whether it's a university, a corporation, or a city. And it works, but it works commercially. It might draw people, but I'm not sure that it really creates public space in the way that I would like public space to be created. Overawed, it's almost like a theme park experience. And my concern about the Libeskind, that tendency is that it suits almost too readily our obsession, our contemporary obsession with the traumatic. If our modernist predecessors looked almost too much towards the future, I think we are fixed traumatically way too much on the past. And I worry about that tendency. Yes, Louise?
Yes, would you like to comment on the small size of new utopian architecture? Buildings where we're supposed to work, we're supposed to live, we're supposed to make us happy. We're supposed to make us happy, but people don't like living in tall buildings with no public spaces.
Right.
So now Walt Disney has built his famous city celebration, which is supposed to be utopia on a small scale, engineered communities, so there are public spaces and so forth. People don't seem to like it much. So would you like to comment on that?
So they both got it wrong sometimes?
Yeah. Perhaps it is impossible to please humanity.
Well, that's the most un-utopian thing I think I've ever heard. I think it might be true. It's hard to look back on those abstract paintings or those urbanist designs that are effective tabula rasas with much glee now. And clearly they did not, if they were executed at all, I think in many ways the great modernists like Gropius and Le Corbusier are blamed for what mediocre architects and designers did with their ideas, mostly in this country. This is a common critique on the right of the international style of modern architecture. Tom Wolfe said, from Bauhaus to our house, it was all one bad road. But certainly, we've come to be very skeptical of this idea that human beings can be completely redesigned in a new order, and that architecture and urbanism can be effective ways to do this retooling. On the other hand, the postmodern reaction against this modern impulse, which again is utopian in essence, it's not much better, as you suggest. In the extreme is the Disney communities, but even our good Princeton friend Robert Venturi and company, what they celebrate is as he says, the ordinary and the ugly. Some of his famous lines are, the main street is almost all right. Learning from Las Vegas, this is the way the world is, and we should design the way people want it to be, like Las Vegas. If the modernist utopia wanted to transform us too much, it seems that the postmodern figures from Venturi to Disney communities just want us to be accommodated to the world as it is. There's no utopian dimension there at all, except some vision, some ideological vision of an American past. Should
I've been studying the student work on the right, and I'm trying to understand it.
it's just a model.
Okay, those things that are hanging on the bottom.
They're,
those
yeah, I
things-
should have explained. They're actually fishing weights.
Okay.
So this whole thing was suspended by these wires and counterbalanced. So he wanted to suggest that each fishing weight actually represents an anchor to show how it could be held in place and how the panels would in fact float. And how it's not just this energy generator, it was also on the weekends to be reconfigured as this kind of fantasy island where people could come sail, play, and picnic. So it had both this kind of functional utopian dimension and this play dimension as well.
Did he have a way of explaining where these things that were hanging down, what would be supporting them, or what would hold up? They seem
The panels were supposed to float,
Oh, okay. So
and
this is
the
just-
anchors were just to be anchors. to hold
Okay,
it.
and what's above this is just what he needed to do to create
Yeah,
this.
so it actually, it was just over in School of Architecture a year and a half ago, and you'd walk by at night and you'd see this extraordinary thing just float. It's really fabulous. I mean, I expect great things from this guy. That's actually one of the nice aspects of the university is how international it's become. So there are all kinds of different visions of the future in play in different parts of the university. Certainly the School of Architecture is one laboratory for them. Anything else you want to get home? So, thank you for coming.